In 1798, deep in the wilds of Kentucky, a quiet farm hid a truth so horrific, entire families entered its gates, but none ever came back. What if I told you that what happened there was so monstrous, so carefully erased, that even the court records were scrubbed clean? Stay with me, because by the end of the story, you will see how easily trust can be turned into a weapon, how a neighbor's kindness can mask a slaughterhouse, and how bones were made to vanish in the soil of a Christian family's farm. And I promise you this, you will never look at a farmhouse the same way again. The last known sighting of the Carter family was not unusual. A wagon creaked slowly along the wilderness path, its horses tired, its passengers hungrier still. Silas Carter, a man in his early 30s, had packed everything he owned with his wife and 2 young boys. They were chasing the promise of Kentucky's fertile land. Like so many restless settlers before them, the autumn sun was fading, and the roads were unsafe at night. So when a friendly farmer waved them down, offering warm bread and a place to rest, Silas gratefully accepted. The farm looked unremarkable. A whitewashed house, a sturdy barn, fields lined with neat fences. Smoke rose from a chimney that smelled of oak and meat. The family that greeted them was everything a weary traveler could hope for. Smiling, warm, devout. Elias, patriarch, insisted they join hands in prayer before supper. His wife, Mary, sang a hymn while ladling soup into wooden bowls. The boys were given fresh milk, the kind that coats the lips with cream. Every detail was perfect, but perfection has a way of drawing suspicion, though never in time to save the victims. Silas and his family bedded down in the loft above the barn, unaware that others had laid in the same straw and never risen again. Sometime after midnight, the barn door creaked open. The family stirred, half awake. Then the lantern light caught their faces. There were whispers, quick movements, and then screams that carried no farther than the wood and earth around them. By dawn, the wagon was abandoned, the horses untethered, the Carter family gone. All that remained was a small bonnet, bloodied, trampled into the dirt. At first, nobody questioned it. The frontier was cruel, unpredictable. Families disappeared to Indian raids, bandits, sickness, or the wilderness itself. Who would blame a farmer for helping travelers who never reached their destination? But then came the next disappearance, and the next, and soon the whispers could no longer be ignored. The Harp family's reputation stood like a wall against suspicion. Elias was the kind of man people trusted. He donated generously at the meeting house, his voice loud and steady in hymns. His handshake was iron. His wife carried the look of virtue itself, always with herbs and remedies at hand, tending to the sick. Neighbors swore she had cured fevers that might have killed others. Children in the village adored her. When storms struck, they opened their doors to stranded travelers, offering food, prayer, and warmth. Who could fault such Christian charity? Yet something about the farm was wrong. Those who stayed briefly noticed small peculiarities that hindsight would later magnify. The prayers at dinner stretched on far too long, the words repeated, almost desperate. Elias's eyes would linger on guests with a peculiar intensity, his smile too still, his laugh rehearsed, and the barns, far larger than their modest herd of livestock required, were locked at night with iron latches no cow or horse could challenge. Neighbors noted strange fires in the night, acrid smoke that stung the eyes. When asked, Elias said he was burning brush or preserving meat, though the odor was different, heavier, and always came after visitors had left. The frontier was not a place for suspicion. People minded their own affairs. But as 1798 gave way to 1799, the pattern became undeniable. Families on their way west vanished with disturbing regularity. Their wagons were found with valuables still inside. Horses grazed freely. And always, their last known stop had been near the Harp farm. Constable Jacob Winters began to hear the murmurs. He had seen much in his time, bandits, scalpers, thieves, but something about the clustering of disappearances gnawed at him. Winters was not a man of superstition. He believed in facts. He began quietly recording the names, the dates, the places. When his notes all pointed to the same location, He saddled his horse and rode there himself. The farm greeted him with open doors and practiced hospitality. Mary offered him bread and warm milk, her voice soothing as she explained the family's devotion to God. Elias shook his hand firmly, speaking of hard work, honest toil, and divine blessing. The barns, Elias explained, were fortified because thieves prowled the countryside. Winters listened, nodded, even accepted their food. But his eyes lingered on the freshly turned soil behind the barn, earth too recently disturbed to be natural. He left that day with nothing he could act on. No body, no witness, no confession. Only suspicion, and suspicion was not enough. But suspicion became proof in the form of a child. One morning, a boy stumbled onto a neighboring farm, barefoot, starving, and terrified. He was no older than 9, his clothes torn, his skin bruised. Between sobs, he told a story. His family had been invited to stay at the harp farm. They prayed together, ate together, and then screams tore through the night. He had hidden in the hayloft, pressing his hands over his ears as his parents cried out. When silence returned, he crept down to find only emptiness, bloodstains, and strangers' moving bodies beneath the barn. The boy remembered his mother's bonnet, torn and red, lying in the dirt. He remembered Elias's voice, calm, humming a hymn, as he dragged something heavy across the floor. This testimony could not be ignored. Winters gathered men, armed and grim, and returned to the farm. The family greeted them as before, but this time Winters did not smile. He ordered the barns opened. Elias protested, waving scripture, invoking God, but the locks were broken. The doors swung wide. The stench that met them was not of livestock. It was heavy, cloying, unmistakable. Beneath the straw they found a trapdoor. Rough steps descended into darkness. Lantern light revealed what no one wanted to see. A chamber carved into the earth, walls lined with crude beams, shackles bolted into wood. A table stood in the center, stained with deep, dark streaks. Bones lay scattered in corners, some gnawed, some charred, others clothed in scraps of fabric too small for adults. Men gagged. One vomited. Winters forced himself forward, cataloging the horror. He had seen death before, but not this. This was not the work of survival, not a crime of passion. This was industry. Digging around the property revealed more. Pits hastily covered, soil soft and dark, yielding bones with every strike of the spade. Dozens, perhaps more. Too many to count. The land itself was rich with the dead. The harps denied everything. Elias invoked the devil, claiming evil men planted the evidence. Mary wept, clutching her children, insisting she knew nothing. But then, under questioning, one of the older daughters broke. Her voice was barely a whisper as she confessed. Papa said the Lord forgives all. She told them. Papa said the Lord provides, and travelers are weak souls who do not deserve the blessings of God's chosen. They only took what the Lord allowed. The words silenced the room. What had seemed a farm of prosperity was revealed as a slaughterhouse hidden in plain sight, a Christian hymn masking screams, a family business built on bones. And here lies the darkest truth. No record was ever kept of the exact number of victims. The community destroyed the farm, burning it until nothing but ash and stone remained. They dragged the family to trial, but even the court could not catalog the dead. Some said 20, others swore more than 50. The bones were scattered shallow, sometimes burned, sometimes fed to livestock. Names were lost. Graves went unmarked. The frontier swallowed the evidence whole. But stories have a way of lingering. The ground remembers, even if men forget. They said the smoke could be seen for miles when the farm finally burned. The neighbors, hardened men who had filled forests and fought wolves with their bare hands, stood in silence as the fire consumed the house, the barns, the sheds. It was not justice. It was an exorcism. No one sang hymns. No one prayed. The crackling of timber and the screams of livestock were the only funeral the harp farm received. But the fire could not erase what had already seeped into the soil, and it could not silence the memory of what Constable Winters and his men had seen below the barn. The confessions, when they came, were not clean. They did not unfold in a courtroom with neat testimony and precise records. They came in fragments, in half-spoken whispers, in the broken words of children who had lived under the roof of killers and never known it as wrong. One girl said her father would select families based on their wagons. The stronger the horses, the finer the belongings, the more likely they were to be lured inside. Another said her mother insisted on long prayers before each killing, prayers for forgiveness muttered in a trembling voice. They spoke of fire pits that burned day and night, of meat smoked in ways that made travelers uncomfortable to eat. It was not just the killings that horrified the community. It was the method. It was the precision. Strangers were welcomed with smiles, given bread and milk blessed in God's name. Then, when darkness fell, the barn became a chamber of judgment. The men were dispatched first, often quickly, strangled, struck, or bound until they ceased struggling. Women were taken below, kept in the pit where shackles dug grooves into the beams. Some were held for days, others only hours. Their fates were the same. Children, the confessions revealed, were dealt with mercilessly. Elias considered them unworthy to inherit, and often killed them with his own hands. This was not savagery. This was logistics. The belongings of the victims were stripped and sorted, wagons hidden, horses sold or bred. Clothing was washed and worn by the family, sometimes the very next day, as though it had always been theirs. Jewelry was melted down. Tools were incorporated into the farm. Nothing was wasted. Even the bodies were treated with efficiency. Some were burned, some buried shallow, some fed to pigs. It was a grotesque parody of farming itself, the land enriched by blood, the livestock fattened by human flesh, the family's prosperity built upon a foundation of corpses. Neighbors who once admired the harps now reeled as they pieced together the truth. How many times had they shared bread with this family? How many times had they prayed together in church? Had they sung hymns with voices still hoarse from screams muffled in the ground? And the question that no one dared voice aloud: had any of them eaten food seasoned with ash that was not from wood, but from flesh? Constable Winters pressed for answers, but answers only deepened the horror. Why had this gone on for so long? Why had no one stopped them sooner? The frontier was vast, law was thin, and records were poor. A missing family could be blamed on the wilderness. A vanished traveler might have simply moved farther west. The Harps had chosen their time and place perfectly. They were predators in a land without hunters. But as the investigation spread, so too did the fear. Every farm became suspect. Every friendly neighbor a possible wolf in disguise. Women whispered about strange looks they had ignored. Men recalled fires in the night they had dismissed as brush burning. The very concept of hospitality, the bed offered to a weary traveler, the meal given freely, curdled into suspicion. There were darker whispers still, once too unsettling to speak openly. A trader claimed to have seen salted meat hanging in the Harp smokehouse that bore no resemblance to pork or beef. A child recalled being forced to eat stew that tasted wrong. Could it be true? Had the family's prosperity been fed not just by theft, but by something more unspeakable? The trial did little to clarify. Records from the frontier courts were haphazard at best, and many were deliberately destroyed, as though the community wished to erase the stain rather than preserve it. Witnesses contradicted each other. Some claimed there were 20 victims. Others swore it was over 50. Bones unearthed around the property suggested numbers too high to count. Winters himself admitted that the pits yield skeletons without end, a phrase scribbled in the margin of a notebook that has since vanished. What was recorded with certainty were the family's denials. Elias never admitted guilt. He spoke of the devil, of enemies who conspired against him, of false witnesses. Mary wept and begged for mercy, insisting she had known nothing, that her husband's hand had guided all sin. But the children's words contradicted her. They said she had prayed over each killing, that she had tended to wounds inflicted on captives, that she had whispered hymns as men were strangled. The community could not tolerate such contradictions. The verdict was inevitable, even if the trial was flawed. But a verdict could not answer the deeper question: why? Why had a family, blessed with land, health, and respect, turned their home into a slaughterhouse? Some said greed. Others whispered madness. A preacher claimed it was heresy, a twisting of scripture into justification for murder. One chilling interpretation suggested the family saw themselves as God's chosen, cleansing the land of weak and wandering souls, inheriting their possessions as divine reward. Whatever the reason, it had persisted for years, hidden in plain sight. And so, when the sentence came, it was not met with cheers. It was met with silence. The community had no appetite for vengeance. They had seen too much, heard too much. Executions could not erase the screams that still seemed to echo in the fields at night. But not everyone believed justice had been served. Some claimed not all the family members were punished, that in the chaos of the burning farm and the trials, some children were spirited away, adopted by distant kin. Their names changed. Could they truly have escaped the shadow of their upbringing? Or did the seeds of horror carry on, hidden under new roofs, waiting to sprout again? Constable Winters himself was never the same. He withdrew from public life, his hair turning white within a year. In his later writings, fragments of which survive, he spoke not of the killings, but of the silence in the barn. The quiet, he wrote, was worse than the screams. The quiet told me they had done this before, too many times, with too much ease. It was not frenzy. It was order. Order. That was the word that haunted him. Because the Harp Farm was not chaos. It was not madness erupting in blood. It was systematic. It was careful. It was a family that lived in two worlds. The world of hymns, smiles, and charity by day, and the world of chains, blades, and bones by night. That duality terrified him more than the killings themselves. If such order could exist in them, could it not exist in others? And perhaps it did. For though the farm was gone, disappearances did not end. Travelers continued to vanish in Kentucky's wilds. Wagons abandoned, horses left grazing, belongings untouched. Some were surely victims of the wilderness, of bandits, of the countless dangers that haunted the frontier. But others whispered that imitators had arisen, inspired by the harps, emboldened by their legend. If one family could prosper so long in plain sight, why not another? Winters never gave the community an answer. He withdrew further, drank heavily, and died in relative obscurity. But his notes, scattered in private collections, suggest he never stopped searching. In one, he scrawled a final thought in shaking hand. We burned the farm, but not the root. The root grows still. The soil of Kentucky is rich, rich with bones, rich with blood, rich with secrets that never reached the ledgers of law or church. And if the harps taught anything, it is that the smiling neighbor, the generous farmer, the devout Christian can hide a darkness deeper than the grave. And though their story was meant to be buried, meant to be forgotten, meant to vanish like smoke against the sky, the bones beneath the ground whisper otherwise. The trial was not a single day, nor a single moment of reckoning. It stretched over weeks, broken by absences, delays, arguments. In truth, the court was unprepared for such a case. The frontier expected horse thieves, drunkards, the occasional violent feud, not an entire family accused of orchestrating slaughter on their own land. The benches of the courthouse creaked under the weight of neighbors who once praised the harps, now staring at them with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Elias stood tall, unbent. He wore the look of a man unjustly accused, his voice steady as he invoked scripture and claimed persecution. He spoke of the devil, of enemies jealous of his prosperity. He accused Winters of envy, of twisting evidence to destroy a good Christian household. Mary, by contrast, dissolved into tears at every opportunity, clutching a handkerchief, her voice breaking as she declared ignorance. She was a wife, a mother, nothing more. How could she know what Elias did behind closed doors? How could she stop what she never saw? But the children cracked the mask. They were called reluctantly, their small frames swallowed by the echoing courtroom. Their words came in whispers, halting at first, then spilling faster under questioning. They spoke of prayers before each killing, of the way their mother's voice quavered as she begged for forgiveness. They remembered screams muffled under the barn, the smell of smoke that clung to their clothes, the strange meat they were told to eat without question. One girl described her father carrying a baby into the woods and returning alone, his hands empty, his face calm. The audience shifted in their seats, faces pale. Testimonies like these did not need embellishment. They rang with a terrible simplicity, the kind of detail no child could invent. And though Elias thundered against them, calling his own children liars, tools of the devil, their voices carried more weight than his practiced rage. Outside the courthouse, the ground itself seemed to testify. As men continued digging at the ruins of the farm, more bones surfaced. Some were charred beyond recognition. Others bore marks of blades, of blunt force, of shackles. Cloth still clung to certain skeletons, fabric that neighbors recognized, a bonnet, a shawl, a child's shoe. Each new discovery hardened the community's resolve, yet the numbers never aligned. One grave yielded 3 bodies, another only fragments. For every skeleton unearthed, 2 more families remained unaccounted for. Winters, exhausted and grim, admitted that they could never know the full toll. The wilderness had swallowed too many. Fire and livestock had devoured others. There is no ledger that can hold it, he told a colleague, his voice low. The land itself is their grave. The court, overwhelmed, chose clarity over completeness. They fixed blame squarely on Elias and Mary, condemning them for the murders even as uncertainty lingered over the scale. The children were spared, though whispers followed them for years. Some were adopted, others vanished into obscurity. The community could not bear to punish them, but neither could they forget the words that had spilled from their lips. And still, questions gnawed at those who attended. Why had no one noticed sooner? Could so many disappearances truly be ignored? The truth was bitter. The frontier devoured people regularly. Families moved west and were never heard from again. Bandits prowled. Disease struck without warning. When a wagon vanished, it was easier to blame the wilderness than to imagine the smiling neighbors down the road had killed them. One elderly man, testifying in the trial, confessed that he had dined with the Harps more than once. He had eaten their bread, drunk their milk, prayed at their table. They looked no different from any of us, he said, his voice trembling. And that is what chills me still. I saw nothing, only kindness. And all the while, there were bones beneath my feet. The verdict was delivered in silence. Elias was sentenced to death. Mary's fate was less certain, the jury torn between her tears and the children's words. Some wished to see her hang beside her husband. Others whispered that perhaps she had been a victim too, bound by fear, unable to resist. The law, flawed and fragile, could not settle the matter with certainty. But the community had no such hesitation. To them, the Harps were guilty as one. The farm was already ash, the barns collapsed, the soil blackened by fire. Neighbors would not let such a place stand. They salted the earth where the pits had been dug, as though to purify it, though everyone knew salt could not cleanse the memory of what had been found there. Constable Winters, meanwhile, kept writing. His notebooks, scrawled in uneven script, reveal a man unraveling. He described dreams of the barn, the silence that suffocated him as he descended the steps into the chamber. He wrote of faces he had never seen, victims he had never met, whose names he would never know. The worst, he wrote, is not the blood, nor the bones. The worst is the order. They lived among us in peace by day, and killed with precision by night. Not madness, not frenzy. Order. Order. That word repeated through his notes like a refrain. Winters seemed less haunted by the scale of the killings than by the methodical calm with which they had been done. To him, the Harps proved that evil needed no frenzy, no wildness. It could wear a steady face, sing a hymn, shake your hand at church, and still drag a family into the ground before dawn. The trial ended, sentences were carried out, and still the disappearances did not stop. Travelers continued to vanish in Kentucky's wilderness. Wagons left to rot, horses wandering untethered, belongings untouched. Some were surely the work of bandits, of disease, of the countless perils of the frontier. But others whispered that the Harps had planted something that could not be burned away, a seed of imitation, an idea too terrible to destroy. If one family could build prosperity from slaughter, could others not try the same? Whispers grew of farms farther west, of inns that seemed too welcoming, too generous. No proof ever came, only rumor. But the fear lingered, a shadow cast long after the fire had cooled, and in the ruins of the Harp farm, long after the ashes scattered, long after the earth was salted, people swore they still heard things at night. A faint hymn carried on the wind, the sound of chains shifting in the dark, children crying in voices that did not belong to the living. The court closed its records, the community buried its shame, and history began to forget. But the land never did. The bones remained, waiting, as if to remind every passerby that beneath the mask of virtue, horror can take root and thrive. The gallows were raised at dawn, the wood rough and unpolished, as though the carpenters had rushed to finish before the rising sun. A crowd gathered, not out of justice alone, but out of something darker, a hunger to see the man who had lived so long among them, laughing, praying, trading, now stand revealed as a murderer. Elias walked to the scaffold without trembling, his stride unbroken, his eyes scanning the sea of faces as if searching for someone to meet his gaze. He carried no shame. He quoted scripture, his voice steady, insisting that judgment belonged to God alone. Some said he smiled faintly as the rope was fitted around his neck, as though he believed himself untouchable. When the trapdoor opened and his body dropped, there was no sound but the creak of the rope and the murmurs of the crowd, half satisfied, half unsettled. Death came quickly, but peace did not. Mary's fate was less decisive. The court had delayed her sentence, and in that gap of time her story began to fracture. Some insisted she was complicit, that her tears were nothing but performance. Others swore she was a prisoner in her own home, her silence bought with threats, her survival tied to obedience. In the end, the law faltered. She was not hanged beside her husband. She was sent away, vanishing from Kentucky records, swallowed by the wilderness of rumor. Some said she remarried under a false name, living quietly in another settlement. Others believed she was killed in secret by those who could not stomach her freedom. No grave of hers has ever been found. The children were scattered, divided among families who agreed to take them in. Some neighbors adopted them out of pity, others out of obligation, but none were ever truly welcomed. In whispers, people called them cursed, blood-tainted, marked forever by the crimes of their kin. At night, when one of them cried out from nightmares, foster parents would shush them quickly, fearful the neighbors might hear and suspect the evil was rising again. A few of the children grew up and changed their names, disappearing into anonymity. One boy became a preacher, traveling from town to town, his sermons fevered with guilt and repentance, though he never revealed who he truly was. Another girl reportedly married young and moved west, her children never knowing the family they descended from. Their lives became fragments, footnotes lost to the tide of time, but the stigma never lifted. Constable Winters never recovered. He had done what was required of him, and more, but the cost was carved into his face. His journals, preserved by his descendants, grew increasingly unsteady, his handwriting crooked, his thoughts scattered. He wrote of shadows in the corners of his home, of voices that whispered in the night. He dreamed of the cellar, of bones lined in neat rows, waiting to be counted. Once he described a vision of Elias standing at the end of his bed, rope still knotted around his neck, smiling as if to say the gallows had meant nothing. Winters died younger than most men of his time, his body failing under weight unseen, his mind consumed by images he could not silence. But it was not only Winters who was haunted. The entire community bore the mark. Neighbors who once prided themselves on unity now eyed one another with suspicion. Hospitality became tainted. Where once travelers could knock at any door and expect warmth, now there was hesitation, a tightening of jaws, a silence before acceptance. Fear had crept into the very heart of frontier life. Stories spread like wildfire, and with each telling, the truth twisted. Some claimed Elias drank the blood of his victims, others that Mary carved charms from their bones to keep the devil at bay. Children whispered of ghostly lights flickering over the ruins of the farm, of screams that rose from the salted earth on stormy nights. Families avoided the land, even when fertile soil beckoned. No settler dared rebuild there, for every plow that cut into the earth risked unearthing another skull. And yet, the story did not die. It traveled with traders, with migrants, with soldiers. Tales of the farm of horrors reached Tennessee, Virginia, Ohio. Some dismissed it as folklore, a frontier exaggeration to frighten children into obedience. But others carried it as a warning. Evil can wear the face of kin, of faith, of neighbor. Evil can offer bread with one hand and a blade with the other. What unsettled people most was not the harps themselves, but the silence that had sheltered them. How many had walked by the farm and seen nothing? How many had shared meals, traded goods, prayed in the same pews, never sensing what lay beneath? That silence became its own kind of guilt, a reminder that horror can thrive, not only through the hands of killers, but through the blindness of those who will not look too closely. Years passed. Kentucky grew. Settlements spread. Towns formed. Roads cut through forests. But the legend lingered. Even as memory faded, the tale of the farm was retold around campfires, each version darker than the last. Some said Elias had made a pact with the devil, his descendants cursed to wander. Others said Mary's ghost roamed the woods, weeping for the children she could not save. Hunters swore that when their dogs strayed near the ruins, they howled and refused to approach, tails tucked, eyes wide. One century blurred into another, yet still the whispers remained. Travelers reported strange shapes in the fog, lights flickering among the trees where the farm once stood. A few dared to camp there, only to wake in terror, convinced they heard voices beneath the ground. Skeptics scoffed, but those who spent nights near the site rarely returned for a second. Historians, searching later, found little in the way of records. The trial transcripts, if they ever existed, were incomplete. Winters's notebooks contained more anguish than evidence. Local papers, scarce in those years, mentioned only fragments. Some suggested the story had been exaggerated, conflated with other killings of the era. But bones do not lie, and the bones had been found. The truth, in the end, was both smaller and greater than legend. Perhaps the harps killed dozens, perhaps hundreds, perhaps fewer. The exact number will never be known. What is known is this: for years, a family lived as farmers, neighbors, worshippers, and by night, they turned their home into a slaughterhouse. They blended with the world until the line between ordinary and monstrous blurred beyond recognition. And that, more than anything, is why their story endures. Because if horror could take root in Kentucky soil in 1798, if it could thrive behind the mask of a smile, then where else might it be hiding still? Those who walk near the old site say the air is colder there. They say the wind carries a hymn with no source, that the ground still shifts when you stand too long, as though something beneath stirs uneasily. Perhaps it is nothing more than imagination, the residue of stories told too many times. Or perhaps the land remembers and refuses to let go. The farm of horrors became a tale of warning, a reminder whispered to children and retold to strangers. Beware the doors that open too easily, the neighbors too eager to invite you in. For behind the warmth of a fire and the promise of bread, the darkest kind of hunger may be waiting. And though the names fade, though graves are unmarked and bones uncounted, one truth remains etched in the silence of Kentucky's hills. Evil does not always come with fangs or fury. Sometimes it wears the face of family. Sometimes it smiles across the table. And sometimes it lives just down the road,